The morning Caesar broke free from the south paddock and cornered 3 grooms against the garden wall, no one thought to fetch a housemaid. The stable yard at Fenwick Hall stood in that particular late autumn stillness that belongs to the hour before the household properly wakes, when the air smells of cold stone and horse, and the frost has not yet quite retreated from the cobblestones. Caesar occupied the center of it like a sovereign surveying disputed territory. He was a large dog, a great Irish wolfhound, with a coat the color of a winter storm standing nearly to a grown man's waist, and in the 18 months since his mistress had died, he had become something the grooms no longer called by his name in an ordinary voice. They called him the Beast, and they said it quietly. Mr. Hedges, the head groom, had tried a chain and lost the chain. He had tried a length of rope, and the rope had been shredded against the paddock post. He stood now at the stable door, with his hat in his hands, and a look on his face that men of 50 do not often permit themselves in the sight of younger men, which was a look of honest, uncomplicated fear. The 3 grooms pressed against the garden wall said nothing. Caesar did not bark. He did not need to. Cecily Harwood appeared at the servants' gate, carrying a bucket of spent ash from the upper fireplaces, her gray dress plain against the pale morning, her dark hair pinned in the severe way Mrs. Peel required of the housemaids. She had not been sent. She had simply heard the commotion from the passage window and come to look, and she set the bucket down against the gate-post because her hands were cold and she wanted to blow on her fingers, and Caesar turned his great head and looked at her. She looked back at him. She did not run. She did not freeze. In the particular rigid way people freeze when they wish to appear unafraid. She simply looked at him with the unhurried attention she gave to most things, and then she walked across the cobblestones toward him. "Enough of that," she said, not harshly. Caesar made a sound low in his chest. He watched her approach. He was still perfectly capable of moving. There was nothing wrong with him, nothing injured, nothing wild beyond what grief makes in an animal that has loved one person and found all others insufficient. Cecily stopped 2 feet from him and held out her hand, palm down at knee height, and waited. Mr. Hedges drew a breath through his nose. One of the grooms against the wall made as if to speak, and thought better of it. Caesar lowered his head and pressed his skull against her open hand. The sound Mr. Hedges made was involuntary. He recovered himself and said, in the dismissive tone of a man who has been frightened and requires someone else to be lesser for it, "It is only the housemaid. The animal has no judgment." At the upper window of the east wing, a figure stood very still. Lord Alistair Vane, Baron of Fenwick, had been awake since before the frost, and was dressed for the morning in the dark coat he wore for estate work, and he had watched the whole of it, the chaos of his grooms, the dog in the center of the yard, and then the gray-dress girl who had walked across the cobblestones as though it were simply the natural direction to walk. He watched her hand on Caesar's head. He watched Caesar accept it. He turned from the window without expression and went to his study and did not speak of it to anyone. Cecily Harwood had come to Fenwick Hall in the spring of that year, the April after her father died. Her father had been a schoolmaster in the village of Ashton, 12 miles north, a man of modest means and considerable learning who had believed that a daughter's mind was worth cultivating, and had cultivated Cecily's accordingly, so that by the age of 20 she could read Latin passably, spoke French with the accent of a woman educated rather than bred to it, and could discuss the natural philosophers of the previous century with the sort of quiet competence that surprises people who have assumed otherwise. Her father's death had left her with £4 10s, his books, and the understanding that Latin does not pay for lodging. She had taken the post at Fenwick Hall without ceremony, packed the books in a trunk, and arranged herself inside the hierarchy of the great house with the efficiency of a person who has decided that there is no point being wounded by a situation one cannot change. The wound existed, of course. It lived in the particular way she held her tongue when Lady Dorothea spoke to her in the flat, uncurious voice people reserve for those they do not imagine have any interior life worth consulting. It lived in the shelf above her cot where the books were arranged spine-in, so that no other housemaid would read the titles and find them strange. It lived in the mornings when she built the fires in the library and allowed herself 10 minutes among the barren shelves before the household woke, touching the spines, reading nothing, simply knowing the books were there. She did not expect anything from Fenwick Hall beyond a wage, and a roof she had understood since April. That expectation, in her present situation, was a luxury she could not afford. Lady Dorothea Vane was a woman of 58 who administered Fenwick Hall, as she administered everything in her orbit, which was to say with perfect confidence that the correct order of things was the order she preferred. She had been a formidable woman before her son's marriage and had managed his household during the marriage with the efficiency of someone who does not quite believe that authority has been transferred. When Eleanor Vane died, Lady Dorothea had taken up the full reins again without discussion, and if she felt anything at the loss of her daughter-in-law beyond a complicated relief, she did not show it in any way that reached the servants. Her plan for her son was not a secret. She had communicated it to Fenwick Hall's drawing room at the beginning of November, when Miss Philippa Calder came to call for the first time that season. Miss Calder was 24, and the daughter of Sir Edmund Calder of Larchbrook, a well-connected man with a clean estate, and no objection to a match with the Baron. Philippa herself was genuinely pleasant, poised, without coldness, and wore her dark hair in the fashionable clusters of curls that required a lady's maid of considerable skill. She arrived in a carriage with a crest on the door and sat in Fenwick Hall's drawing-room and complimented the arrangement of the autumn flowers with the easy graciousness of a woman who has been raised to find something to praise in every room she enters. Cecily served the tea. She did not look at Miss Calder with anything as pointed as assessment. She moved among the furniture of the drawing-room, in the invisible way well-trained housemaids learn to move, setting the tray and pouring and retreating, and she noted only the thing that could not quite be hidden, which was Miss Calder's eyes finding the door twice in the 10 minutes Cecily was present, with the reflexive caution of someone who had been told about Caesar and was listening for claws on the parquet. Caesar was not in the drawing-room. He was, at that moment, somewhere Cecily would not have predicted. She had begun walking him 3 days after the morning in the stable-yard, because Mr. Firsty. Hedges had come to her in the passage in the middle of the afternoon, and said, with the elaborate indirection of a man who will not acknowledge that he is asking a housemaid for help, that the animal would not eat if it could not walk, and it would not walk with any of the stable hands, and Mrs. Peel had said she might be spared from the upstairs rooms for an hour in the afternoon if the Baron had no objection. The Baron, when Mr. Hedges inquired, had said nothing. He had simply turned back to the ledger on his desk, which Mr. Dood. Hedges had taken as consent. Cecily had found the lead hanging on a hook inside the saddle-room. It was not the chain or the rope that Mr. Ruvel. Hedges had tried but an older thing, a leather lead of good workmanship that had been hand-stitched along the seam with dark thread and fitted with a brass clip worn smooth with use. She had not known whose it was. She took it because it was there, and because Caesar had come to the saddle-room door and looked at it with his head tilted at the particular angle. Dogs use when a thing means something to them. She clipped it to his collar, and he walked beside her through the kitchen garden and out along the field path toward the lower meadows. And he did not pull, and he did not veer, and the afternoon light came through the bare oaks in long, pale columns, and lay across the frozen grass. On the 4th day of their walks, she heard the voices. She came back into the stable yard through the lower gate with Caesar at her side, and she heard young Tommy's voice, thin and careful in the way of a child who has learned that objection makes things worse. And then the harder voice of one of the younger grooms, a man named Caro, who was 20 and unkind in the particular way of people who have been given a small authority for the first time and do not know what to do with it, except press it against whoever is below them. You left the barrow wrong side round, and now the whole south passage wants clearing again, Caro said. Do it again, and you'll do it by moonlight. Tommy was 12 and slight for it. He stood holding the barrow handles and did not answer, which was the right instinct, and Caro's voice climbed a notch toward the pitch that precedes something worse. Cecily crossed the yard. She did not run. She walked with the same unhurried directness she had walked toward Caesar on the first morning, and she stopped beside Tommy and put her hand on the barrow handle and said, "The passage wants clearing from the south end, Tommy. Start there and work back, and it will go faster." She looked at Caro. "Thank you, Mr. Caro," she said, in a voice that was entirely civil and entirely a dismissal. Caesar stood at her knee, with his weight slightly forward, and said nothing. Caro looked at the dog and then at Cecily and then walked away. What Cecily did not see was the figure at the corner of the stable wall. Lord Vane had come out for the afternoon's review of the winter fodder stores, and had stopped when he heard Caro's voice and had not moved during any of what followed. He watched Tommy take the barrow and begin toward the south passage, with the relieved efficiency of a child who has been delivered from something. He watched Cecily's hand on the lead, which had not tightened once. He watched Caesar at her knee. He stood at the corner of the stable wall for a moment, after they had gone in through the servants' gate. And then he went inside, and said nothing to anyone, and did not explain. 2 days later. Why, Caro had been reassigned to the barn at the North Farm. The reassignment happened without ceremony. It happened the way Lord Vane's decisions often happened at Fenwick Hall. They arrived as accomplished facts, unattributed, without discussion. He was a man who did not explain himself. He was 34, and he had been the Baron of Fenwick for 6 years, and he had been a widower for 18 months. And in that 18 months, he had settled into a quality of silence that the household had learned to read not as grief, but as character, because it was easier. Even Lady Dorothea read it as character. Only Mrs. Peel, who had been at Fenwick Hall for 22 years, understood that it was grief, wearing character as a coat. The first afternoon he stopped Cecily in the corridor was 3 weeks after the morning in the stable yard. She was carrying the morning's letters from the hall table to his study, and he came out of the study door as she rounded the corner, and they very nearly collided. She stepped back. He stepped back. Caesar, who had been following him from the breakfast room, moved around him and pressed his head against Cecily's hip in a proprietary way that made the Baron go still for a moment. "You have been walking him," he said. "Yes, my lord." He looked at Caesar. He looked at the letters in her hands. "He does not walk easily," he said, as though the sentence were not quite finished. "He walks well enough," Cecily said. "He simply wants to know that the person beside him is not afraid of him." There was a pause. He studied her face with the direct, unhurried attention of a man who is accustomed to being the one who looks, and not the one who is looked at, and Cecily felt the particular heat of it at the back of her neck that had nothing to do with the fire at the end of the corridor. "He has no groom," she said, because the silence needed something in it, and this was true and neutral. "No one from the stables who knows him." "No." He was quiet for a moment. "He was my wife's dog." Another pause. Shorter. "She died before I came home. Caesar has not forgiven anyone who was not there." He said it without inflection. He took the letters from her hands with the efficient manner of a man conducting a transfer of papers and went back into his study and shut the door, and Cecily stood in the corridor with her empty hands and the weight of what he had said settling into her. Caesar had pushed back around her and was sitting at her feet. She reached down and touched the top of his head once, briefly, and went back to the passage stairs. Few have wondered even for a moment whether a dog can understand a grief he witnessed at close quarters and carry it forward past all practical reason. Stay with this story a little longer. Perhaps not in the way a person understands with language and the conscious arrangement of cause and effect. He understood nonetheless that the woman who had clipped his leather lead to his collar each afternoon was not afraid, and that she did not require anything of him beyond his company, and that this was the same quality of presence his mistress had offered, the same unhurried reliability that had made him hers from the beginning. He was not replacing one with the other. He was recognizing a quality. The Baron came to her again on a Tuesday in early December. He appeared at the library door in the early afternoon, when she had come to rebuild the fire, and found that the ash-bin was too full to take more, and she was down on her knees with a small brush and the pan and the problem of where to put the excess ash, and he stood in the doorway and watched this for a moment before he said, "There is a larger bin in the passage." She stood up. "Thank you, my lord." He did not move from the doorway. He came in instead and stood beside the fire, and she moved to give him the room that her station required, and he moved with her, which she did not expect, and she found herself standing not at the correct distance, but at the distance of a conversation. "The library," he said. "Do you come in often?" "Only to tend the fire, my lord. Hedges tells me you kept Caesar on the East Meadow path for the full afternoon on Thursday. That is 2 miles. He needed the distance, my lord. He has not gone 2 miles since she died. He did not say her name. He said she and Cecily understood entirely who was meant. She used to take him out in all weather. He would walk beside her for miles without the lead and come back when she whistled." Cecily said nothing. She had learned, in the years since her father died and in the months since she came to Fenwick Hall, that there are things people say in quiet rooms that are not looking for an answer. They are looking only for a listener who will not flinch. He looked at her directly then. "Can you whistle?" The question was so unexpected that she nearly laughed. She caught it before it arrived. "Yes, my lord." She had a particular signal. 3 notes. He paused. "I would not expect you to know it." "No," Cecily said. "I can teach him another." The silence that followed was the kind that changes the temperature of a room. He stood very still for a moment, and then he moved past her toward the door, and he said without turning, "The leather lead you use, where did you find it?" "In the saddle room, my lord, on the south hook." He stopped. He did not turn around. "Yes," he said, "leave it there when you are done with it. Please." He left. Cecily looked at the fire for a long moment, and then she went to fetch the larger ash bin from the passage, because the household did not stop for a quality of silence, however complete. Lady Dorothea came to the drawing-room on a Thursday morning when Miss Calder was expected for luncheon, and she summoned Cecily with the particular efficiency of a woman who has a task to complete before a guest arrives. She wanted the side table repositioned and the bowl of winter greenery moved from the mantel shelf to the table nearer the window, and she directed these operations with the crisp impatience that Cecily had come to understand was not personal displeasure but simply Lady Dorothea's mode of inhabiting a room. When the bowl had been placed, she looked at Cecily with the first sustained attention she had offered in 6 months. "I am told," Lady Dorothea said, "that you have made yourself useful with the Hound." "I have been walking him, my lady." She adjusted a sprig of holly that did not require adjustment. "You are the only person in the household who has managed it, which is curious, given that you have been here less than a year. The dog is not complicated, my lady. He wants to know that a person's attention is genuine." Lady Dorothea looked at her for a moment longer than the conversation required. "Miss Calder is coming for luncheon," she said. "I would like the dog kept in the kitchen yard for the afternoon. He unsettles her." "Yes, my lady. I will speak to Mrs. Peel about it." She turned back to the window. "And Cecily, when Miss Calder and Lord Vane take the turn in the garden after luncheon, you are not to be about the grounds. I do not want the animal making for you across the lawn." It was the first time Lady Dorothea had used her Christian name. People in authority use Christian names when they wish to remind someone of their place. They do not use them as warmth. Cecily understood this and dipped her head and went back to the passage stairs. And Miss Calder arrived at noon in the crested carriage and was installed in the drawing-room with the repositioned bowl of winter greenery catching the pale winter light, just as Lady Dorothea had intended. Lord Vane came down for luncheon at the correct time, and sat at the head of the table, and was entirely civil and entirely distant, and Lady Dorothea watched him across the soup course with the contained patience of a woman arranging a piece of furniture that keeps moving. Cecily did not hear what was said at the table. She was in the kitchen yard with Caesar, sitting on the low wall with the worn leather lead in her hands, and Caesar had his head across her knee and was watching the pale winter sky with the resigned companionship of a dog who has learned that the places he is permitted are determined by other people's fears. After luncheon, as Lady Dorothea had planned, Philippa and the Baron walked in the garden. From the kitchen yard, Cecily could not see them, but she could hear Miss Calder's voice occasionally, pleasant and light, and the Baron's responses shorter. And she sat on the wall and looked at the leather stitching on the lead and did not think about any of it. In the drawing room, 3 days later, when Miss Calder came again for afternoon tea, Lady Dorothea said to her, in the carrying voice of a woman in her own house who does not think the passage door is improperly latched, "You mustn't mind the dog. Way, he attaches himself to odd things. The footmen say he follows nothing more than the housemaid." Miss Calder said in a voice that was genuinely kind and therefore somehow worse, "Poor creature. I suppose he does not know the difference." Cecily, on the other side of the passage door, which was not latched as tightly as anyone supposed, heard both sentences entirely. She stood still for a moment with her hand against the wall. She heard Miss Calder add after a pause, "She is merely the housemaid, Lady Dorothea." "I am sure it means nothing," Lady Dorothea said. "Of course. Ring the bell, would you, dear?" Cecily walked back down the passage stairs with her hand still flat against the plaster wall, feeling the cold of it, letting it be simply cold. She was 22, and she had her father's books above her cot, with their spines turned in, and she had 4 months left until her wages were paid at Lady Day. And she walked down the passage stairs with the lead coiled in her pocket, and did not cry, because she had understood since April that she could not afford it. Lady Dorothea came to Cecily's room the following Sunday. Housemaids do not often receive visits from the chatelaine of the great house. The room was small and cold, and the ceiling had a water stain in one corner, and the books above the cot were spine-in. Lady Dorothea stood in the doorway, which was as much of the room as she chose to enter, and she was precise and not unkind, which was in its way more difficult than unkindness. "I want to say something to you plainly," Lady Dorothea said. "You are a capable woman. Mrs. Peel thinks well of you. I have no complaint about your work." Cecily stood beside the window with her hands at her sides. "My son is going to make Miss Calder an offer before the new year. This is the correct thing, and I intend to see it done without unnecessary complication." Lady Dorothea met her eyes directly, and her own eyes were not cruel. They were simply clear, in the way of a person who has decided that clarity is a form of kindness. "I am asking you not to make yourself conspicuous. The dog must go back to the stables or be transferred to the North Farm. You have been kind to him, and I am not ungrateful for it. But the situation has become visible in ways I do not wish it to be." Cecily said nothing. "I am not threatening your position," Lady Dorothea continued. "I am asking you to understand it. You are 22 years old, Miss Harwood, and you are not without prospects in your own sphere. I would be sorry to see you misplace your hopes." It was the most Lady Dorothea had ever said to her at one time. It was also entirely accurate. Cecily knew this, and the knowledge sat in her chest like a coal that has gone out and is still warm. "Yes, my lady," she said. At dinner that evening, Lady Dorothea spoke to the assembled table, with Lord Vane at the head, his estate steward, Mr. Brant, for the week's accounts, and the winter vicar, Mr. Prant. Ashford and his wife, and said in the course of discussing the household arrangements for the Christmas season, that Miss Harwood was to be reassigned to the scullery for the winter quarter, as extra hands were needed below stairs. She said it the way one says a thing that has already been decided, which it had. Lord Vane, at the head of the table, said nothing. He was looking at the wine in his glass, and his face was still, and Cecily, who had been at the sideboard with the second remove, read his silence the way she had learned to read it, as consent, as the minimum sufficient acknowledgment of what his mother had arranged. She set the dish she was carrying on the sideboard, and went out through the service door and walked down the passage stairs and sat on her cot and looked at the books above it. She began to pack the trunk that night. She did not do it dramatically. She did it the way one does a necessary practical task, taking each book from the shelf with care and wrapping it in the spare petticoat that served as packing material and setting it in the trunk with the spine up this time, because there was no longer any reason to hide it. Mrs. Stepper. Peel came at 9:30 with a cup of tea she had not been asked to bring, and she set it on the trunk lid and sat in the chair by the window without saying much. And she looked at the books going into the trunk, and she said, "Only, where will you go?" "I will write to the registry in Ipswich," Cecily said. "There will be something," Mrs. Peel said. In the tone of a woman who has seen a great deal and keeps her conclusions to herself. Caesar scratched at the servant's door that night for 20 minutes before the hall boy chased him back to the kitchen. Cecily heard the scratching from her room one floor up, and she lay on her cot in the dark and listened to it, and pressed her hand flat against the worn leather of the lead that she had put in the trunk, because she had not yet decided whether to leave it or return it to the saddle-room hook. The musical evening had been Lady Dorothea's idea. She liked a gathering in December, the drawing-room lit to its best effect, the right assortment of neighbors and local worthies arranged for her son's consideration, and Miss Calder was naturally to play. She played very well. She had a light, confident touch on the keys, and she played the fashionable Italian pieces correctly and without nerves. And this was, Lady Dorothea had long believed, the kind of accomplishment that a man notices even when he thinks he is not noticing. The drawing-room was arranged with 12 chairs, and the pianoforte at the south end, and the fire was very good, and Mrs. Peel had the tea things ready in the adjacent sitting room. Cecily was to manage the service with one of the junior housemaids. She had not finished packing. She had stopped partway through the previous night, not because she had changed her mind, but because a kind of exhaustion had taken her that was not quite sadness and not quite anger, and had no useful name in the Regency vocabulary of feelings a housemaid was permitted to have. She had put the trunk against the wall and slept, and in the morning she had risen and dressed and braided her hair and gone to her duties, and she had not seen Lord Vane all day, and the leather lead was in the trunk. The guests arrived at 7. Miss Calder came in the crested carriage with her parents, and she wore a pale yellow gown that suited her very well, and she took the seat Lady Dorothea had chosen for her near the pianoforte, and Lord Vane stood at the edge of the room in his evening coat and spoke to Mr. Bast Ashford about the parish building fund and looked at no one with any particular attention. Cecily moved through the room with the tea things, placing and retrieving cups with the practiced invisibility of 3 seasons in service. The junior housemaid, a girl of 16 named Bess, managed the other side of the room and kept dropping her eyes to the floor. Whenever Miss Calder looked in her direction, Cecily did not drop her eyes, she simply moved. Miss Calder began to play at 7:30. She played beautifully, and the room gave her the attention she deserved. And Lady Dorothea sat in her chair near the fireplace with the contained satisfaction of a woman whose plan is proceeding. Lord Vane was not in his chair. He had stepped out of the room, presumably to the library or to the hall, as men sometimes do when they require a moment, outside the polite necessity of a drawing-room, and he had not come back. Cecily noticed this in the same peripheral way. She noticed most things. It was a fact. It was not her concern. She was placing the used cups on the tray near the passage door when she heard his step in the corridor outside. The familiar, deliberate tread of a man who knows his own house. She heard him stop. She heard Caesar. Caesar had followed him from wherever he had been, having the impeccable instinct of a large dog for exactly the moment his presence will be most noticed, and he had found her through the half-open passage door and was pushing into the doorway of the drawing-room, with his head low and his tail, for once moving. "Caesar," she said very quietly. "Not now. Leave him." Lord Vane was in the doorway. He had said it to her in the particular low, direct voice he used when he was not performing anything for anyone's benefit, and the word leave had no dismissal in it. It was, like his commands usually were, a form of permission. Miss Calder had stopped playing. The room had turned, with the collective reflexive attention of 12 people in a confined space, toward the doorway. Caesar crossed the room to Cecily. He sat down at her feet and leaned his weight against her leg with the complete lack of ceremony of an animal who has decided, and Lord Vane followed him across the drawing-room floor. He crossed it in the way a man crosses a room when he has made a decision. Not quickly, not with performance, but with the particular absolute certainty of someone who has been considering the direction for some time, and has only just allowed himself to move. Lady Dorothea's fan was perfectly still in her lap. Miss Calder, at the pianoforte, had turned on the bench. Her expression was a complicated thing, a kind of startled recognition that resolved slowly into something that was perhaps relief. The recognition of a woman who has sensed for some weeks that the room in which she is the correct choice is not quite the room in which she is the wanted one. Lord Vane stopped in front of Cecily. He was close enough that she had to look up, and she did, because she did not look away from things, simply because they were difficult, and his face was open in a way she had not seen it before. The controlled distance of 18 months laid down like a coat a man sets aside when he has come indoors for the last time. He did not speak immediately. He allowed the weight of the room to settle, the witnesses present and attending, Lady Dorothea at the fireplace, and the vicar with his teacup halted, and Mr. and Mrs. Triet. Calder at the back wall, and then he said it, quietly and without performance and without any particular interest in whether the room found it satisfying or not. Miss Harwood is not the housemaid, she is mine. The room held the sentence for a moment the way a room holds a sudden change in weather before it resolves into rain or sun. Lady Dorothea's fan did not move. Miss Calder's hands were still on the keys. She looked at Lord Vane for a moment with clear eyes, and then she looked at Cecily with the same clear eyes, and she did what only a genuinely decent person does in that particular moment. She looked, she understood, and she did not make a scene. Mrs. Calder at the back wall took her husband's arm. Lord Vane was still looking at Cecily. He had not taken his eyes from her face. She had not taken her eyes from his. Caesar pressed harder against her leg. She said very quietly, "My lord." It was not a protest. It was not an acceptance. It was simply the only word she had that was not too large for the moment, and he received it the way he received most things she said, with complete attention and without visible haste. What happened next was not theatrical. Lady Dorothea rose from her chair and said to Mrs. Calder that the tea service in the sitting room was ready, and the guests followed her with the cooperative instinct of people who understand that they are being given a dignified avenue of exit, and within 4 minutes the drawing-room had been vacated with a thoroughness that spoke well of everyone's breeding. Lord Vane and Cecily and Caesar were alone in the drawing-room. The fire was very good. The pianoforte bench had been pushed slightly back from the keys, as though someone had meant to return to it and would not. He said after a moment, "You were packing your trunk." She looked at him. "Mrs. Peel told you." "Mrs. Peel left the trunk half open, and I found the room in the morning when I went to check whether Caesar had been at the servant's door." He paused. He had been at the servant's door. "Yes," Cecily said. "I heard him. He has not done that since Eleanor died." The name, said plainly without the avoidance that had surrounded it for 18 months, sat between them in the warm air. He said it the way people say a name they have been avoiding, long enough that the avoidance has become its own kind of cruelty. "I was not there when she died," he said. "There was flooding on the South Farm, and I went to manage it, and she went into labor 3 weeks early. By the time I came back, it was done." He was not asking her to absolve him. He was simply saying a thing that was true, in the same way she had listened to him say the thing about Caesar. In the library, because it wanted a listener who would not flinch. Caesar was with her. She died with him at the foot of the bed, and the lead in her hand. Cecily looked at him. She said, "The leather lead." Yes. She had it in her trunk. She had put it in the trunk because she had not decided whether to leave it or return it, and now she understood that the decision had been simpler than she had known, that the lead had been left on the saddle-room hook, not to be kept on a hook, but to be found. "I did not know whose it was," she said. "I know. You were not meant to." He looked at Caesar for a moment, and his face carried in it everything that 18 months of a grief, held too tightly, looks like, when it finally loosens. "He walked with you." "He has not walked well for anyone since her." "He knows you are sad," Cecily said. "He cannot fix it, and he cannot forgive the people who were not there, and so he waits. He has been waiting for someone who is not afraid of what he is carrying. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the silence of a thing that has been named accurately for the first time and is resting in the naming. Lord Vane looked at her with the direct, unhurried attention she had noticed in the corridor months ago, and it carried something now that it had not carried then, or perhaps it had always carried it and she had not allowed herself to read it correctly. "My mother will be impossible for a fortnight," he said. "Your mother will be satisfied," Cecily said, "when she understands that what is correct and what is wanted are not always opposite." A muscle moved at the corner of his mouth. It was the closest thing to amusement she had seen in his face, and it occurred to her, in the particular helpless way of a thing occurring against one's will, that it suited him. He took a step toward her, and then another, and the fire was behind him, and the room was warm, and Caesar had shifted his weight from her leg to the floor between them, and he lifted his hand, and his fingers found the side of her face with a carefulness that was not hesitation but was instead the full weight of a person who has been waiting longer than they knew they were waiting. She felt it the way one feels the warmth of a fire when one has been outside too long, the specific quality of it, the fact of it, the understanding that this is what heat actually is. She turned her face into his hand. Caesar settled onto the drawing-room carpet with a sound like a long exhalation. Outside the tall windows, the December dark was beginning to turn toward the fine powder of snow that falls in East Anglia in the earliest hours of morning, and the room held them, and neither of them spoke for a moment, and neither of them needed to. The fortnight that followed was not simple, because nothing worth having at Fenwick Hall arrived without the weight of its particular complications. Lady Dorothea had her fortnight, as predicted, and it manifested as a quality of pointed silence over meals, and a series of administrative consultations with Mr. Bull and Brant that appeared to concern the household accounts, but which everyone understood to be Lady Dorothea processing a situation she had not arranged. She did not make a scene. She was not a woman who made scenes. She was a woman who realigned, and the realignment took precisely 14 days, at the end of which she came to Cecily in the morning room and said, in a voice that was as close to an acknowledgment of error as she had ever produced, "I understand, Mrs. Two. Harwood's family were originally of Cambridgeshire." "My father's people. Yes, my lady," Cecily said. Lady Dorothea looked at the pianoforte in the corner. "You play, I suppose." "My father taught me." Another pause. "You will want to have your books moved from the servants' rooms to the library." She did not say anything else. She moved to the window and looked at the morning garden, and Cecily understood that this was the form Lady Dorothea's peace offering took, and she received it as what it was. The books made their way to the library in the first week of the new year, carried in 2 trips by Mr. Brant's boy, who set them on the bottom shelf nearest the fire, because Cecily had said that was where she would most often be. Mrs. Peel, who was told everything eventually and always by people who believed they were telling no one, nodded when she heard, and said only, "Well," the trunk wanted unpacking. In any case, it was Lord Vane who told her about the lead. He told her in the kitchen passage, a week before Christmas, when she came in from Caesar's afternoon walk, with the cold in her cheeks, and found him waiting, which was unusual, but not unprecedented by that point. He was holding a cup of tea he had poured himself from the kitchen pot, because the household had not yet learned what latitude the new situation permitted, and so he had simply done it himself. He handed it to her and she drank it, and they stood together in the passage with Caesar between them and the smell of the kitchen behind the door. And he said, without preamble in the way he said things, the lead was hers. "I had it made for her when Caesar was given to her as a pup. She always used it herself. Never trusted it to a groom. She said he knew the difference between being handled and being walked with." Cecily looked down at the lead in her hand. "She was right," she said. "Yes." He looked at Caesar, who was sitting on his feet with the imperious patience of a large dog who has decided a room belongs to him. "She was right about a great many things. Whore." Cecily said, "I will take better care of it." He shook his head very slightly. "I gave it to you." She looked at him. He was looking at Caesar, or at the air in front of Caesar, or at the distance in which his wife had walked a wolfhound pup along the same field path that Cecily had walked for 3 months. And there was in his face the composite of grief and gratitude, and something more present than either, and she did not look away from it. "Then I will keep it," she said. He turned toward her then, and the corridor was narrow, and the kitchen warmth was at their backs, and Caesar had laid his great head on Lord Vane's boot and was watching them both with calm dark eyes, and Lord Vane said her name for the first time. Cecily. Just that. Her given name said plainly, in a corridor that smelled of cooking fires and cold stone, with no audience but a dog, and the winter dark beyond the high window. She lifted her face. He did not say anything more for a moment. He did not need to. He had said the necessary thing, the one word that crosses the distance propriety requires, between a Baron of Fenwick and a woman who has been for precisely 8 months and 3 weeks his housemaid. And it could not be unsaid, and he knew it, and she knew it, and Caesar pressed harder against his boot. With the full proprietary weight of an animal who has approved, that was how it began, properly. Not in the drawing-room with the witnesses, and the sentence delivered to the assembled guests, though that moment mattered, and would be told later as the story's turning point. Not in the library, or the stable-yard, or any of the rooms that history and the household's collective memory would choose as the more fitting backdrop. It began in the kitchen passage, with a cup of tea going cold, and a worn leather lead in her hand, and a dog between them on the flagstones, and the word was simply her name. The snow came that night, the fine powder that settles without drama on the fields of East Anglia and makes the morning pale and still. By the time the household rose, the grounds were white to the lower wall, and the bare oaks along the field path were furred with it, and Caesar was at the servants' door, at first light, impatient. Cecily unbolted the door and let him out, and followed him, the leather lead in her hand, and the cold air met her face, and the snow was untracked across the kitchen garden, and she stood for a moment and listened to the absolute silence of it. Lord Vane came out behind her. He had put on his estate coat, and his breath came in small white clouds. And he did not say anything, and she did not say anything. And Caesar bolted across the white garden in the direction of the field path, and they both watched him go, and then walked after him, not hurrying into the pale winter morning that belonged now to both of them.